Lynn had always known that her marriage to Kwan would be an uphill battle. Kwan came from one of the wealthiest families in the city, while she was just a girl from a humble rural background. What Lynn didn't expect was the hostility from Kwan's family, particularly from his mother, Madame Tao, and his sister, Mai. From the moment she stepped into the sprawling mansion where they lived, Lynn was treated like an intruder, a stain on the pristine reputation of the family. Her days were filled with endless chores: cleaning, cooking, fetching items for the family members, tasks typically left to servants. But in this household, Lynn had become the help. She scrubbed the marble floors until her hands bled, prepared elaborate meals under the watchful eye of Madame Tao, and endured sneers from Mai, who made it her mission to remind Lynn of her place at every turn. "What else can you expect from someone like her?" Mai often remarked. "No education, no grace. What did Kwan see in you?" Lynn swallowed the humiliation, reminding herself that she had come here for love. Kwan had promised her a new life, a partnership, but that promise felt further away with each passing day. Kwan was increasingly absent, always busy with work or late-night meetings that stretched into the early hours. Lynn hardly saw him anymore, and when she did, his love for her seemed dimmed, as if the mansion's grand walls had drained it from him. One evening, after yet another day of servitude, Lynn found herself alone in the study. The room smelled of mahogany and cigars, the air thick with the scent of a life she was beginning to understand she'd never truly belonged to. She pulled a drawer from Kwan's desk, searching for a notepad to write a grocery list. But her hands froze when she found something else instead. It was a stack of papers, neatly organized, and at the top was a familiar name, hers. Her eyes scanned the text, heart thumping in her chest. It was then that the cold truth unraveled before her eyes. They were never married, at least not legally. The papers detailed a contract, one between Kwan and his family. Lynn had been nothing more than a facade, a temporary fix to keep rumors at bay. The marriage wasn't registered, and legally, Lynn was no one to Kwan. The discovery was like a slap across her face, a brutal reminder of how expendable she was in their world. Suddenly, everything made sense. The disdain from Madame Tao, the mockery from Mai, Kwan's growing distance. He never truly intended to keep her. Her hand trembled as she set the papers down, her mind spinning. She had been nothing more than a pawn in their game, a poor girl easily used and discarded. But the worst revelation was yet to come. In the corner of the drawer was an envelope, carelessly tucked away. Lynn recognized the handwriting on the envelope. It was Kwan's. She pulled the letter out, her breath catching as she unfolded it. The words stabbed her like daggers, an exchange between Kwan and another woman. Their affair was not only recent, but deep, filled with promises of a future, the kind of promises he once whispered to Lynn under the moonlit sky of their courtship. It all became clear now. His late-night meetings, the constant distance, the way he looked at her with barely concealed guilt. Kwan wasn't just cheating on her emotionally. He was planning his future with someone else, someone who wasn't her. Lynn's tears flowed freely as she stood in the study, the weight of her betrayal crushing her chest. But even as her body trembled with grief, something darker and more resolute began to build within her. They had treated her like a servant, a joke, and now a fool. But Lynn was none of those things. She had been patient, kind, and loving, traits they had mistaken for weakness. It was time to show them just how wrong they were. Lynn knew that the walls had eyes. In a household as cold and calculated as this one, even her smallest actions would be scrutinized. If she was going to leave, it had to be done in silence. No one could know, especially not Kwan. That night, after dinner, Lynn made her way back to the cramped little room she had been given in the mansion. The opulence of the house was ironic, considering she was barely allowed to touch any of it. Her room had none of the elegance or luxury that the rest of the estate boasted. It was tucked away in a corner, like a servant's quarters, small, cold, and utterly impersonal. She opened the closet, carefully pulling out a modest suitcase she had brought from her home in the countryside. The items inside were few: simple dresses, a couple of personal belongings, and a small box where she kept her most precious possessions. One of those items was a photograph of her parents. She paused for a moment, holding the photo close to her chest. Her parents had always dreamed of her having a better life. If only they knew. With her things neatly packed, Lynn sat down on the bed and pulled out a notebook she had been hiding under the mattress. It was time to make a plan, something detailed, foolproof. Revenge wasn't something she could rush. If she wanted to bring Quan and his family down, she had to be smart about it. No hasty decisions. No emotion-driven outbursts. She needed to hit them where it hurt the most: their wealth, their pride, and their reputation. But first, she had to disappear. The next morning, Lynn went about her chores as usual. She scrubbed the floors, washed the dishes, and attended to every request from Madame Tao and Mai without complaint. But her mind was elsewhere, calculating every move. That afternoon, when she was sure no one was paying attention, Lynn slipped out the back door. She had been planning this for weeks now, secretly transferring small sums of money into a separate account, slowly gathering the resources she needed to vanish without a trace. She walked briskly down the street, heart pounding, but her face was calm. She didn't look back at the mansion. There was no need. Once she reached the city, Lynn made her way to the train station. She bought a one-way ticket to a place far enough that no one would think to look for her immediately. As she boarded the train, she could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her shoulders, but it was also liberating. She wasn't running away out of fear. She was preparing. Sitting by the window, Lynn watched the city blur into the countryside as the train sped forward. She had always loved the simplicity of rural life, the quiet and the stillness. But now, that life seemed like a distant dream, something that no longer belonged to her. She had been changed, hardened by betrayal and the cruelty of others. Once the train arrived at its destination, a small coastal town, Lynn checked into a modest guest house under a fake name. She paid in cash, ensuring that no electronic trail could be traced back to her. For the next few days, she stayed hidden, carefully reviewing her plan. Lynn began by gathering information. She knew Quan's family's businesses inside out from overhearing countless dinner conversations and observing their dealings. They owned a chain of luxury hotels and resorts, all built on the foundation of their impeccable reputation in society. Lynn knew that reputation was as fragile as glass. A single crack, a single scandal could shatter it. She spent her days researching, finding weaknesses in their operations, allies she could use, and potential enemies they had made over the years. Lynn was meticulous, her notebook filled with notes, names, dates, and details that could be exploited. She was no longer the naive girl who had walked into that mansion hoping for love. Now, she was a strategist, preparing to dismantle the very life they had so arrogantly built. By the end of the week, Lynn had formed the beginnings of a network. Through careful inquiries, she found people who had grievances with Quan's family, disgruntled employees, former business partners who had been cheated out of deals, and rivals who would be more than happy to see the mighty empire crumble. She connected with them quietly, offering them just enough information to gain their trust, but never revealing too much of her own plan. Each night, Lynn would return to her guest house, mentally exhausted but satisfied. She was no longer the victim in this story. She was the architect of their downfall. But there was still one thing that lingered at the back of her mind: Quan. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the lies, a small part of her still remembered the man she had fallen in love with. She hated herself for it, but the memories of their early days together, when he had been kind, when he had made her laugh, still haunted her. In the silence of her room, Lynn allowed herself to cry. Not for Quan, but for the girl she used to be. The girl who believed in love, in fairy tales. That girl was gone now, replaced by someone stronger, someone who would stop at nothing to get what she deserved. As she wiped away the last of her tears, Lynn made a silent vow. She would never let anyone humiliate her again. Lynn knew the moment had come. Every piece of her plan was slowly falling into place. But revenge, she reminded herself, was not just about destroying her enemies. It was about rebuilding herself from the ashes of everything they had taken from her. In the small coastal town, Lynn's days became a carefully orchestrated routine. She worked part-time at a quiet cafe near the beach, where no one knew her or her past. Her role was simple: serving coffee, cleaning tables, blending into the background. She didn't need attention. In fact, she avoided it. What she needed was time. During her shifts, Lynn quietly listened to conversations. The cafe was often filled with tourists, many of whom were familiar with Kwan's family's chain of resorts. Some spoke with admiration about the luxury hotels, others with disdain about the rumors of how they treated employees. Lynn's ears perked up every time she overheard a disgruntled guest or ex-employee. These fragments of complaints were like breadcrumbs, leading her to the cracks in the perfect image Kwan's family had worked so hard to maintain. By evening, Lynn would return to her modest guest house and continue piecing together her plan. She made anonymous phone calls to local journalists, dropping hints about labor disputes and unethical practices at Kwan's family hotels. She left tips about secret deals that had cut out local businesses, providing enough information to spark their interest, but never too much to reveal her identity. Soon, the whispers of discontent began to grow louder. Local news stations started running stories about worker mistreatment and questionable business practices in Kwan's family empire. The reputation they had spent years building was slowly starting to crack. But Lynn knew this was only the beginning. One evening, as Lynn sat in her room, going over the latest news reports about Kwan's family, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number, a contact she had been cultivating for weeks, an ex-employee who had worked closely with Kwan's father. This person had valuable information, enough to bring down the entire empire if used correctly. The message was simple: "I have what you need. Meet me tomorrow." The next day, Lynn met the man in a quiet park. His name was Hui, and he looked just as tired and defeated as she had been when she left the mansion. His face was lined with years of hard work, betrayal, and bitterness, but behind his weariness, Lynn saw something familiar: resolve. "They ruined me," Hui began, his voice low but filled with anger. "I gave them my life, my loyalty, and they discarded me like I was nothing." Lynn listened silently as Hui recounted his story, how Kwan's father had promised him a promotion, only to turn around and give the position to a family friend. How he had been blacklisted from other companies when he tried to leave, making it impossible for him to find work. His life had crumbled, just like Lynn's. "I've been keeping records," Hui said, pulling out a folder from his bag. "Emails, contracts, phone calls, everything. I was going to use it to fight back, but I don't have the resources. Not anymore." Lynn's heart raced as she opened the folder. Inside were documents that could destroy Kwan's family. Hidden financial transactions, bribes to government officials, and evidence of illegal labor practices. It was a gold mine of corruption, and Lynn knew that in the right hands, this information would be devastating. "I'll help you," Lynn said quietly, her voice steady. "But we have to be careful. This isn't just about revenge anymore. It's about justice." Hui nodded, handing over the folder. "I trust you." With Hui's information, Lynn's plan accelerated. She continued feeding the media stories, using the documents to back up every claim. Slowly but surely, the public began to turn against Kwan's family. Protests erupted outside their hotels, investors started pulling out of deals, and legal investigations were launched. The empire was starting to crumble, but Lynn wasn't satisfied yet. She still had one more target: Kwan. Even though the world around him was falling apart, Kwan still hadn't reached out to her. Lynn knew that his pride wouldn't let him admit defeat, not yet. He was a man who had always believed he was invincible, that he could fix anything with enough money and charm. But Lynn knew better. She returned to the mansion one last time, disguised as a reporter for a local news outlet investigating the scandal. It had been months since she left, and yet everything inside looked the same: elegant, cold, and detached from the chaos swirling outside. Kwan was in his study, surrounded by papers and phone calls, desperately trying to control the damage. When he saw Lynn walk in, his face paled. "Lynn," he whispered, almost as if he couldn't believe she was standing in front of him. "What are you doing here?" Lynn looked at him for a long moment, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity. He was the man she had once loved, the man who had betrayed her in the worst possible way. But now, he looked small, fragile, like a child who had lost control of his game. "I came to see how it all ends," she said calmly, her eyes never leaving his. "How you finally lose everything." Kwan stood up, a flash of anger crossing his face. "You did this, didn't you? You're the one behind all of this." Lynn didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth was already clear. "I loved you," Kwan said, his voice breaking. "I know I made mistakes, but I loved you." Lynn laughed bitterly. shaking her head. Love? Is that what you call what we had? You lied to me. You used me. You never loved me. You loved the idea of owning me. Kwan opened his mouth to argue, but Lin held up a hand, silencing him. She had heard enough. This is your end, Kwan, she said softly, but with finality, and it's only just beginning. As Lin turned to leave the mansion, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had done what she needed to do. She had taken back control of her life. And now, it was time to start over, far away from the ruins of Kwan's empire, free from the chains of her past. Lin had always thought that revenge would bring her peace. She imagined that seeing Kwan and his family fall would be the final piece in her journey, the key to unlocking her freedom. And yet, as she stepped out of the mansion for the last time, she didn't feel triumphant. Instead, a quiet emptiness settled in her chest. She had won, yes, but at what cost? Lin returned to the coastal town that had become her refuge, seeking the comfort of its quiet streets and the gentle rhythm of the sea. For weeks, she kept to herself, trying to process everything she had been through. She walked along the beach in the mornings, letting the salty breeze whip through her hair, and sat at the cafe in the evenings, lost in her thoughts. Though she had destroyed the empire that had hurt her, Lin found that her pain still lingered. It wasn't something she could simply erase with vengeance. Healing, she realized, was a much more complicated journey. One evening, as she sat at a cafe table with a cup of tea in hand, a familiar figure approached. It was Hai, the man who had helped her bring Kwan's family down. He had been lying low since the story broke, avoiding the media frenzy that had erupted around the scandal. His appearance was a surprise, but a welcome one. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, nodding toward the empty seat across from her. Lin smiled softly and gestured for him to sit. They sat in silence for a while, watching the waves roll in and out along the shore. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared sense of loss and redemption. Huai had lost everything to Kwan's family, just like Lin, but now they both stood on the other side of that destruction, unsure of what came next. "How are you holding up?" Huai asked after a while, his voice gentle but concerned. Lin shrugged, staring into her tea. "I thought I'd feel more whole, but I don't. It's like I'm still carrying all of this weight, even though it's over." Hui nodded, understanding her pain in a way few others could. "Revenge doesn't fill the void, does it? It gives you back power, but it doesn't heal the scars." Lin sighed, her gaze drifting out to the sea. "I don't know how to move forward from here. Everything I did was to tear them down, and now that it's done, I feel lost." Hui leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "You're not lost, Lin. You've just spent so much time surviving that you've forgotten how to live." His words hit her harder than she expected. For so long, she had been consumed by her anger, her need for justice. But now, for the first time in years, there was no one left to fight. She had no more battles to wage, no more enemies to defeat. "Maybe it's time to start again," Hui continued. "A new life, a new purpose, one that's about you and what you want, not about them." Lin looked at him, her heart heavy but hopeful. Could it really be that simple? Could she just move on? The idea seemed almost impossible, but at the same time, it was liberating. She had been defined by her pain for so long that she didn't know who she was without it. But maybe it was time to find out. In the days that followed, Lin began to take small steps toward rebuilding her life. She decided to stay in the coastal town for a while, far from the city that had once been the center of her world. She quit her job at the cafe, deciding that it was time to find something that made her feel alive again. It wasn't easy. There were still days when she woke up with a hollow ache in her chest, when the memories of her old life felt too heavy to bear. But slowly, little by little, Lin began to rediscover herself. She took up painting, a hobby she had loved as a child, but had abandoned when life had become too chaotic. She spent hours by the sea, letting the colors of the sunset and the crashing of the waves inspire her. The act of creation was healing, a way to express all the emotions she had bottled up for so long. Through her art, Lin began to feel a sense of peace that she hadn't known in years. She painted her pain, her loss, but also her hope and her dreams for the future. Each brushstroke was a step toward healing, a way to reclaim her identity outside of her past. One afternoon, as Lin worked on a new painting, Hui came to visit again. He had become a regular presence in her life, offering quiet support and encouragement when she needed it most. They had grown close in the weeks following the scandal, bound by their shared experiences, but also by a mutual respect for the strength they had both found. "You've really found something here," Hui said, watching her work. "You're talented, Lin. Have you thought about showing your paintings? There's an art gallery in town that features local artists. They'd love your work." Lin hesitated, her brush pausing mid-stroke. The idea of sharing her art with the world was terrifying. For so long, she had hidden herself away, afraid of being seen, afraid of being judged. But maybe it was time to take a risk, to step out of the shadows and into the light. "I don't know," she said slowly. "I'm not sure I'm ready." Hui smiled gently. "You're ready. Trust me, the world deserves to see what you've created." And so, with Hui's encouragement, Lin took her first tentative steps into the world of art. She submitted her paintings to the local gallery, and to her surprise, they were accepted. Her first exhibition was small but intimate, held in a cozy space filled with soft light and the hum of quiet conversation. As Lin stood in the gallery, surrounded by her paintings, she felt something shift inside her. The pain of her past was still there, but it no longer defined her. She had found a way to transform it, to turn it into something beautiful. People moved through the gallery, admiring her work, asking her questions about her inspiration. For the first time in a long while, Lin felt proud of who she was, proud of what she had survived and what she had created from the ashes of her old life. As the evening wore on, Hui approached her, a warm smile on his face. "Look at you," he said softly. "You've come so far." Lin smiled back, a sense of peace settling over her. I wouldn't have made it without you." "You did this on your own, Lin," Hui replied, his voice filled with admiration. "You rebuilt yourself. I was just here to remind you of what you were capable of." In that moment, Lin realized that she had found something far more valuable than revenge. She had found herself. The gallery exhibit marked a turning point in Lin's life, a moment when she finally felt free from the weight of her past. With each passing day, the shadows of Quan and his family faded, replaced by the vibrant colors of her new world. The success of her exhibit had surprised her, but more than that, it had opened doors she hadn't even known existed. People began to talk about her work. Critics, art lovers, even tourists who had wandered into the gallery by chance. Soon, Lin was approached by another gallery in the city, a more prestigious venue, offering her the opportunity to showcase her paintings on a larger scale. It was an opportunity she had never dreamed of, but one she felt ready to embrace. As Lin prepared for her next exhibit, she felt a strange mix of excitement and anxiety. This new chapter of her life was unfamiliar, but it was hers. No one else had power over her anymore. She was no longer the girl trapped in the mansion, scrubbing floors and enduring humiliation. She was an artist, a woman who had taken control of her destiny. One evening, as Lin sat by the window in her small coastal apartment, watching the sun set over the water, Hui knocked at her door. His visits had become more frequent since the gallery opening, and Lin found herself looking forward to his company. There was a quiet ease between them, a friendship born from shared hardship, but now growing into something more. "You're really making a name for yourself," Hui said as he stepped inside, his smile warm and proud. "I saw an article about you in the local paper. They called you the rising star of contemporary art." Lin blushed, still not quite used to the attention. "It's strange," she admitted. "I never imagined my life would turn out this way." Hui leaned against the counter, his eyes soft with admiration. "You deserve every bit of it, Lin. You've worked hard to rebuild yourself. Don't be afraid to enjoy it." They talked for a while, the conversation flowing easily, as it always did between them. But tonight, there was a tension in the air, something unspoken lingering between their words. Lin felt it, an unspoken connection, deeper than friendship, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to acknowledge it. After everything she had been through, the idea of letting someone into her heart again was terrifying. As the night wore on, Hui rose to leave. He stood by the door for a moment, looking at Lin with an intensity that made her heart race. "Lin?" he said softly, his voice filled with a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "I know we've both been through a lot, and I don't want to rush anything, but I care about you, more than I ever thought I could. And I just want you to know that." Lynn's breath caught in her throat. She had sensed Hai's feelings for some time now, but hearing him say it aloud made it real. A part of her wanted to step back to protect herself from the possibility of getting hurt again. But another part of her, the part that had learned to embrace life, to take risks, wanted to open her heart. "I care about you too, Huai," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "But I'm still figuring things out." "I'm still healing." Hui nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know, and I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here, however long it takes." With that, he left, leaving Lynn alone with her thoughts. She sat by the window long after he was gone, staring out at the ocean, her mind racing. Huai had been her anchor through some of the darkest times of her life. But could she trust herself to love again? In the weeks that followed, Lynn threw herself into her art, preparing for her upcoming exhibit in the city. The pressure was greater now, with critics and collectors paying attention to her every move. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, Lynn found solace in the process. Painting had become her way of processing everything she had been through. Her pain, her triumphs, her hopes for the future. One day, as she was working on a new piece, Lynn received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. Hesitantly, she answered, her heart skipping a beat when she heard the voice on the other end. "Lynn," the voice said, filled with desperation. It was Quan. For a moment, Lynn couldn't speak. She hadn't heard from him since that day in the mansion, when she had left him to face the consequences of his actions. Now, hearing his voice again after all this time stirred something in her. A mixture of anger, pity, and curiosity. "What do you want, Quan?" she asked, her voice cold and detached. There was a pause on the other end, as if he were gathering his thoughts. "I know I don't deserve to ask you for anything, but I need your help. Everything's falling apart. The business, my family. I don't know what to do." Lynn felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. There was a time when hearing Quan's voice would have broken her, when she would have done anything to save him. But now she felt distant, as if that part of her life belonged to someone else entirely. "I can't help you, Quan," she said firmly. "Not anymore." "Please, Lynn," he pleaded. "I know I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I'm lost. I don't have anyone left." For a brief moment, Lynn felt a pang of sympathy. Quan had been the cause of so much of her suffering, but he was still human, still capable of feeling pain. But she reminded herself that his pain wasn't hers to fix anymore. "I'm sorry," Lynn said, her voice softer now, but resolute. "I've moved on, Quan. You need to find your own way." With that, she hung up the phone, feeling a strange sense of closure wash over her. Quan was no longer the man who had power over her. She had taken back her life, and now she was free to live it on her own terms. In the days that followed, Lynn's exhibit in the city was a success. People from all walks of life came to see her work, praising her talent and the raw emotion she conveyed through her paintings. She was no longer the girl trapped in a loveless marriage, nor was she defined by the revenge she had sought. She had become someone new, someone stronger, someone whole. And as Lynn stood in the gallery, surrounded by her art, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes of her past, and now the future was hers to create. Lynn had never imagined that life could feel this balanced. After years of living under the weight of betrayal, heartbreak, and revenge, she now found herself in a space filled with promise and peace. The success of her latest exhibit had solidified her place in the art world, and with each passing day, her confidence grew. She no longer felt like the girl who had once been pushed to the margins of her own life. Instead, she was at the center of her own story. But while her professional life thrived, Lynn's personal life remained uncertain. Hui had been patient. He hadn't pressured her to make any decisions, but Lynn knew he still harbored feelings for her. She cared deeply for him, but there was a part of her that remained guarded. After everything she had been through, opening her heart again was more difficult than she had anticipated. One evening, after a particularly successful day at the gallery, Lynn sat by the beach, her sketchpad resting on her knees. She often came here to reflect, to let her thoughts and feelings flow freely onto the pages in front of her. The rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing, a constant in a life that had been anything but stable. Huai joined her, as he often did. He sat down beside her, silent at first, his presence comforting. For a while, neither of them spoke, It was a familiar ritual, sitting together in the quiet, the unspoken connection between them palpable but unhurried. After a while, Hui turned to her, breaking the silence. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice gentle. "Is everything all right?" Lynn smiled faintly, glancing down at her sketchpad. "I've been thinking a lot. About everything. About us." Hui nodded, not pushing her to continue, but waiting patiently for her to find the words. That was one of the things Lynn appreciated most about him. His patience, his understanding. He never demanded more than she was ready to give. "I've been scared," Lynn admitted, her voice soft but steady. "Scared of letting someone in again. After Quan, after everything that happened, I didn't think I could ever trust anyone with my heart." Huai looked at her, his expression filled with warmth and empathy. "I understand. You've been through so much, Lynn. It's only natural to feel that way." Lynn took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill her lungs. "But the thing is, I do trust you, Hui. You've been there for me in ways I never expected. You've seen me at my worst, and you've never once judged me or made me feel like I was less than. And that's why this is so hard." Hui's brow furrowed slightly, his eyes searching hers. "What do you mean?" "I care about you," Lynn said, her voice growing more confident. "I care about you more than I thought I could care about anyone again. But I've spent so much time rebuilding myself, learning how to stand on my own 2 feet. I'm afraid of losing that. I'm afraid of becoming dependent on someone else again, of giving up my independence." Hui reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but reassuring. "Lynn, you're one of the strongest people I've ever known. You've built yourself up from nothing. Being with someone doesn't mean giving up who you are. It's about sharing your life with someone who supports you, who helps you grow. And I would never ask you to give up your independence. That's part of what makes you who you are." Lynn looked into his eyes, searching for any trace of doubt, but all she saw was sincerity. Hui had been her rock, her confidant, her friend, and now, maybe, he could be more. "I want to try," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper over the sound of the waves. "I want to try being with you." A slow smile spread across Hai's face, his eyes lighting up with hope. "I'm not going anywhere, Lynn. We'll take it one day at a time, however long it takes." For the first time in what felt like forever, Lynn allowed herself to relax. She wasn't rushing into anything. She was simply opening her heart, just a little, and seeing where it would lead. And for now, that was enough. The weeks that followed were a new chapter in Lynn's life. She and Hui spent more time together, not just as friends, but as something more. It was slow, gentle, and natural. No grand declarations of love, no sweeping gestures, just 2 people learning to navigate a relationship built on trust and mutual respect. Their connection deepened in small moments, cooking dinner together, sharing stories from their past, walking along the beach as the sun set. Lynn found herself smiling more, laughing in a way she hadn't in years. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when she felt the weight of her past, the fear of losing herself in a relationship. But with Hui by her side, those fears felt more manageable. One day, as Lynn was preparing for another exhibit in a neighboring city, Hui surprised her with a trip. "It's nothing big," he said, smiling as he handed her an envelope. "Just a weekend away. I figured you could use a break." Lynn hesitated, her natural instinct to keep working tugging at her. But something in Hai's eyes convinced her to say yes. The trip turned out to be exactly what she needed. They spent the weekend at a small, quiet resort by the mountains, far away from the pressures of work in the past. It was a chance for Lynn to breathe, to enjoy the present without constantly looking over her shoulder. One evening, as they sat by a campfire under the stars, Huai turned to her with a question that had been on his mind for some time. "Do you ever think about the future?" he asked, his voice soft, almost tentative. Lynn glanced at him, her heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" "I mean, where we're going, what we want, together." The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Lynn had spent so much time rebuilding her life, focusing on the present, that she hadn't allowed herself to think about the future. But now, sitting here with Huai, she realized that the future didn't have to be something to fear. "I think about it sometimes," Lynn admitted, her voice quiet. "But I've been scared to plan too far ahead. Every time I've done that in the past, things have fallen apart." Huai reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "I get that, but I also think Maybe it's time to start dreaming again. Not just for yourself, but for us. Lynn smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Maybe it is. In that moment, Lynn realized that her life was no longer defined by her past. She had learned to trust again, to hope again, and now, for the first time in years, she felt ready to embrace the future, whatever it might hold. The road to commitment. Life was moving forward in a way Lynn never imagined. She found herself falling into a rhythm with Hui that felt natural, almost effortless. The bond between them deepened every day, not through dramatic moments, but through the quiet, steady presence they offered each other. Lynn was still cautious, but with each passing week, she felt her heart open a little more. Her art career, too, was flourishing. She was receiving invitations to exhibit her work in more prestigious galleries, and her name was becoming known among collectors and critics. It felt surreal to Lynn, this newfound success. She had spent so much time struggling that she almost didn't know how to accept the praise. But she reminded herself that she had earned it. Every stroke of her brush had come from a place of truth, from the pain and growth she had endured. Her art was her story, and now the world was listening. Yet, as life began to settle into this new, promising phase, Lynn started to feel a growing restlessness in the back of her mind. The future Hui had hinted at that night by the campfire lingered in her thoughts. What did it look like? Was she ready to fully commit, to let herself dream of a life with him? One evening, after the opening of yet another successful gallery exhibit, Hui came to visit her at her apartment. He brought a bottle of wine to celebrate, but Lynn could see something else in his eyes, something more serious. They sat on the balcony, the soft glow of the city lights below them, as they shared the wine. Lynn could feel the conversation building in the air, and after a while, Hui set his glass down, his expression thoughtful. "There's something I've been thinking about," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with a weight that made Lynn's heart tighten. She looked at him, waiting. "We've been through a lot together," Hui continued, "and I know that this thing between us, it's new. But Lynn, I care about you deeply. I see a future with you. I've never felt this way before, and I'm not saying this to pressure you, but I need to know if you see that future too." Lynn's breath caught in her chest. She had been avoiding this moment for some time now, afraid to confront what she truly wanted. Hui was offering her something real, something lasting, and that terrified her as much as it excited her. "I've been thinking about it too," Lynn admitted, her voice soft. "You've been so patient with me, Hui. You've given me space to heal, to find myself again, and I'm grateful for that. But I've been scared of committing, of losing myself again in a relationship." Hui's eyes never left hers, his expression one of quiet understanding. "I get that, Lynn. I really do. But I need you to know that I'm not Quan. I'm not here to take anything from you. I want to build something with you, something where we both stand on equal ground." Lynn looked away for a moment, her thoughts swirling. She had spent so long rebuilding herself, becoming independent again, that the idea of merging her life with someone else's felt overwhelming. But at the same time, she couldn't deny the connection she felt with Hui. He was different. He had seen her at her lowest and never once made her feel like she was less than. "I want that too," Lynn finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm scared of what it all means." Hui reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, grounding her in the moment. "We don't have to rush anything," he said gently. "We take it at your pace. But I want to be clear about my intentions. I see you in my future, Lynn. I want to build a life with you. I just need to know if that's something you can see too." Lynn's heart raced, her mind flashing back to all the moments they had shared. The laughter, the quiet support, the way Hui had been there for her without expecting anything in return. Slowly, she realized that she did see a future with him. It wasn't something she had allowed herself to dream of before. But now, sitting here with him, she could picture it. "I do see it," she said, her voice more confident now. "I see a future with you, Hui, but I need time. I'm still learning how to trust, how to be in a relationship without losing myself." Hui smiled, his relief evident. "That's all I needed to hear. We'll take it slow, Lynn. I'm in this for the long haul." They sat in silence for a while, their hands still intertwined. For the first time, Lynn felt a sense of calm wash over her. She didn't have to have all the answers right now. She didn't have to know exactly where their relationship would go. But she did know one thing. Hui was someone she could trust, someone she could build a life with, one step at a time. In the following months, Lin and Hui's relationship continued to grow. They spent weekends exploring new places, sharing their dreams and fears, learning more about each other's pasts. It wasn't always easy. Lin still had moments of doubt, times when the scars from her previous life would resurface, making her question whether she was ready for this kind of commitment. But Hui never wavered. He was always there, steady and patient, reminding her that love didn't have to be rushed. He understood her need for independence, for space, and he gave her that without hesitation. One day, as they walked through the city's art district, Lin noticed something different in the way Hui looked at her. There was a nervous energy about him, as if he had something on his mind. "What is it?" she asked, stopping to face him. Hui took a deep breath, his eyes filled with emotion. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you," he said, his voice slightly shaky. Lin's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Hui pulled a small box from his pocket, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. "I know we said we'd take things slow, but I also know that I don't want to spend my life with anyone else. Lin, will you marry me?" Time seemed to stop as Lin stared at the ring, her heart racing. This was the moment she had been afraid of, the moment when she would have to make a decision about her future. But as she looked into Huai's eyes, she realized that she wasn't scared anymore. She knew that this was the man she wanted to build her life with, a man who loved her for who she was, not for what he could make her into. Tears filled her eyes as she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, Huai? Yes?" Hui's face lit up with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger, pulling her into a tight embrace. In that moment, Lin knew that she had finally found the happiness she'd been searching for. It hadn't come from revenge or from success, but from the quiet, steady love of a man who had seen her at her worst and loved her anyway. Shall I continue with Chapter 8, where Lin and Hui navigate their engagement and begin planning their future together? Or building a life together? The days that followed Hui's proposal were filled with a sense of warmth and anticipation that Lin hadn't experienced before. She had accepted his proposal, and though the road to this point had been long and complicated, she now felt a quiet certainty about the future. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. She and Huai had agreed to take their time with the wedding. There was no rush, no need for a grand event. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about building a life together, brick by brick. They talked about what they wanted, not just for the wedding, but for their future. They dreamed of a small home by the coast, where Lin could paint and Hui could continue his work in environmental advocacy, a passion he had quietly nurtured while helping her through the storm of her past. Planning the wedding became a simple joy. Lin found herself excited, not by the extravagance, but by the intimacy of it all. The ceremony would be small, just close friends and a few of Lin's newfound art colleagues. They chose a quiet beach location, somewhere close to where they had spent so much time together. But even as Lin immersed herself in the excitement of the wedding, she couldn't shake the occasional pangs of doubt. She had come so far, rebuilt herself from the ground up. Now that she was preparing to share her life with Hui, she sometimes wondered if she was truly ready for this step. It was one thing to heal, to stand on her own again, but marriage was a different kind of commitment. It wasn't about independence, it was about trust. One afternoon, as she sat sketching by the ocean, her mind drifting to thoughts of the wedding, Huai found her. He sat beside her, watching the waves for a few moments before turning to her. "You've been quiet lately," he said gently. "Are you having second thoughts?" Lin sighed, setting her sketchpad aside. "Not about you," she said, her voice soft but honest. Sometimes I wonder if I'm ready for this. I've spent so long fighting for my independence, learning how to be okay on my own, and now I'm about to commit to a life with someone else. It's scary." Huai nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that. I really do. But Lin, this doesn't have to be like before. I don't want to take anything from you. I want us to build something together, something where we're both equal, where we both have space to be ourselves." Lin looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. Hui had always understood her in a way no one else had. He didn't ask her to be anything other than who she was, and that made all the difference. "I want that too," Lin said softly. "I'm just afraid of losing myself again. I've come so far, and I don't want to go back to being that person who depended on someone else for everything." Hui reached for her hand, his grip reassuring. "You won't lose yourself, Lin. You're stronger than you think, and we'll figure this out together, step by step. There's no rush, no pressure. We're building a life, not just a marriage." Lin smiled, feeling some of the weight lift from her chest. "I know. I just needed to hear that." As the wedding day approached, Lin found herself more at peace with the idea of commitment. She had faced her demons, rebuilt her life, and now she was ready to take this next step with Hui by her side. They had both been through so much, together and apart, and that shared history gave her confidence in their future. The wedding day arrived with the gentle warmth of a coastal breeze. The ceremony was simple, just as they had planned. They stood barefoot on the sand, surrounded by a few close friends, as the waves lapped softly at the shore. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the beach. It was perfect in its simplicity, a reflection of the life they were building together, quiet, strong, and full of love. As they exchanged their vows, Lin felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. This was the life she had chosen, the love she had found after everything she had endured. Hui's words were filled with sincerity and hope, promising her not just love, but partnership, equality, and respect. "I promise to love you, Lin, for who you are, not for what you can give me or what I expect you to be," Hui said, his voice steady and full of emotion. "I promise to stand by your side through the good and the bad, and to always give you the space to be yourself. We're in this together as equals." Lin's heart swelled as she spoke her own vows, words she had been unsure of until this very moment. But now they flowed freely, her voice strong and clear. "I promise to love you, Hui, with all that I am, without losing who I've become. I've learned how to stand on my own, and now I want to stand beside you. We'll build this life together, one step at a time." When the ceremony was over and they were pronounced husband and wife, Lin felt a wave of emotions: joy, relief, and a sense of completion. She had come so far, from the broken girl who had been betrayed by the man she once thought she loved, to the strong, independent woman who had found a partner who truly understood her. The days after the wedding were filled with quiet contentment. Lin and Hui returned to their everyday lives, but everything felt different now. There was a new sense of closeness between them, a deepening of the bond they had already shared. They spent their evenings walking along the beach, talking about their dreams for the future. For the first time in her life, Lin allowed herself to dream without fear. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their small beach house, watching the sunset, Hui turned to Lin with a smile. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Lin raised an eyebrow, curious. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the future. Kids, maybe? Or traveling? Building something bigger?" Lin thought about it for a moment, then smiled. "I do think about it. I think about all the possibilities. And for once, I'm not afraid of any of them." Hui reached for her hand, his touch warm and familiar. "I like that answer." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first time in her life, Lin felt truly at peace. The past was behind her, the future was wide open, and she knew that whatever came next, she would face it with Hui by her side. Shall I continue with Chapter 9, where Lin and Hui begin to face the next steps of their life together? As Ling and Hui settled into their life as a married couple, the tranquility of their coastal home became a sanctuary. Every morning, they woke to the sound of the waves, and every night, they watched the sun set together, content in their shared world. Yet, as peaceful as their life was, both of them knew that life wouldn't remain static forever. There would be changes, challenges, and new chapters waiting for them, and they were both ready to face those together. It wasn't long after their wedding that Lin received an offer she hadn't been expecting. A renowned gallery in New York had reached out, interested in showcasing her work as part of a major international exhibit. It was a dream opportunity, the kind of offer that could catapult her career to the next level. But it also meant leaving behind the quiet life she and Hui had built for themselves, at least for a time. When Lin received the email from the gallery, she was sitting at her small studio, working on a new series of paintings. Her heart skipped a beat as she read through the invitation. The opportunity was incredible, but it also felt overwhelming. She had spent so long rebuilding herself, finding peace in simplicity, that the idea of diving back into the bustling art world was daunting. That evening, when Hui returned from his environmental work, Lin hesitated before telling him about the offer. She wasn't sure how he would feel about it. After all, they had just started their life together, and now she was being pulled towards something that would take her away from their quiet home. When she finally gathered the courage to tell him, Hui listened thoughtfully, his face unreadable at first. "So, they want to show your work in New York?" he asked, sitting down beside her on the porch. Lin nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the email on her phone. "Yes, it's a big opportunity, but it means being away for a while. I don't know if I'm ready for that." Hui was silent for a moment, then turned to her with a small smile. "Lin, this is huge. It's what you've been working toward, isn't it? You've always dreamed of showing your work on an international stage." Lin looked at him, uncertainty filling her chest. "But what about us? We've just started building our life here. I don't want to leave you behind." Hui reached for her hand, his touch steady. "You're not leaving me behind. We're a team, remember? I want you to go for it, Lin. This is your chance to show the world what you're capable of, and I'll be right here, supporting you every step of the way." Tears pricked Lin's eyes as she realized how lucky she was to have someone like Hui by her side. He understood her dreams, her fears, and most importantly, he understood that this opportunity was about more than just her career. It was about the life she had rebuilt for herself. "I don't know what I did to deserve you," Lin said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Hui squeezed her hand, his smile warm. "You fought for yourself, Lin. You deserve this more than anyone. And as for us, we'll figure it out. Maybe I'll come visit you in New York. It'll be an adventure." Lin laughed through her tears, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. Hui was right. This was an adventure, and it didn't mean leaving behind the life they had built. It just meant expanding it. They could make it work together. The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Lin worked tirelessly to get her paintings ready for the exhibit, while Hui took on extra projects with his environmental work, preparing for the time they would spend apart. They talked often about their plans, making sure they were on the same page about what this next chapter would mean for them. When the day finally came for Lin to leave for New York, Hui drove her to the airport. As they stood at the gate, Lin felt a pang of sadness, but it was mixed with excitement. This was her chance to show the world who she had become, and Hui's unwavering support made her feel ready for anything. "I'll miss you," Lin said, holding his hand tightly as they stood together before her flight. "I'll miss you too," Hui replied, his voice soft but full of confidence. "But this isn't goodbye. It's just the next step, and I'll be there as soon as I can." They kissed, a promise shared between them, and Lin boarded the plane with a mixture of hope and determination. As she watched the city fade beneath her, she knew that this wasn't just about her art. It was about proving to herself that she was capable of anything, that she could have both love and success without losing herself. New York was everything Lin had expected and more. The energy of the city was electric, the galleries brimming with talent and opportunity. The exhibit itself was a massive success, her paintings drawing praise from critics and collectors alike. It was surreal to see her work hanging in such prestigious spaces, surrounded by the art of renowned international artists. She had never felt more validated, more proud of the journey she had taken to get here. But as exhilarating as the experience was, Lin often found herself thinking of Hui. They spoke every day, exchanging messages and calls, sharing the small details of their lives. He was busy with his projects back home, but there was never a moment when Lin didn't feel his presence with her. A month passed, and Lin's time in New York was coming to an end. The gallery had offered her a more permanent role, suggesting she stay on to participate in future shows. But Lin knew that her heart belonged elsewhere. As much as she loved the excitement of the city, She missed the quiet of the coast, the simplicity of the life she had built with Hui. One evening, after the final day of the exhibit, Lynn received a surprise. Hui had flown in to visit her, standing outside her hotel with that familiar smile she loved so much. "You didn't think I'd let you come back without a proper reunion, did you?" he said with a grin, pulling her into his arms. Lynn laughed, feeling a rush of joy as she embraced him. "I didn't know you were coming. This is the best surprise." They spent the weekend exploring the city together, but it was clear that both of them were ready to return home. Lynn's success in New York had been thrilling, but her heart was with Hui, in the life they had built by the sea. On the flight back, as they sat side by side, Hui turned to Lynn, his expression thoughtful. "So what's next for us?" Lynn smiled, taking his hand in hers. "Whatever we want. We've got a whole life ahead of us." And for the first time in her life, Lynn knew that she could have it all. A life filled with love, art, and adventure, all while staying true to the person she had fought so hard to become. The plane touched down on the familiar coastal runway, and as Lynn and Hui stepped off into the warm embrace of the sun, Lynn felt a sense of home wash over her. New York had been a dream come true. But this place, this quiet, peaceful town by the sea, was where her heart belonged. It wasn't just the location, it was the life she had created here with Hui. Their life. The return to their routine was a welcome change after the whirlwind of New York. Lynn went back to her studio, painting with a new sense of clarity and inspiration, while Hui dove back into his environmental work, preparing for a new project to restore a local wetland. Life was simple again, but in that simplicity, there was a richness that Lynn hadn't always appreciated. One evening, after a long day, they sat together on the porch of their beach house, watching the waves crash gently against the shore. The air was filled with the scent of salt and the soft hum of the night. "Do you think about what's next?" Hui asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Lynn turned to him, smiling softly. "You always ask me that. What do you have in mind this time?" Hui chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "I guess I'm always thinking ahead, but I mean it. What do you see for us?" Lynn considered the question. So much of her life had been spent looking backward, haunted by the pain and betrayal of her past, that she hadn't allowed herself to truly imagine the future until recently. But now, with Hui, the future seemed less like an abstract idea and more like something tangible, something they could build together, day by day. "I think about it a lot," Lynn admitted. "I think about how far we've come and how much more there is ahead of us. I want more of this. More of the life we've built together. I want us to keep growing, but without losing the simple things that make us happy." Hui smiled, nodding. "I like that. I want that too. But do you ever think about starting a family?" The question caught Lynn off guard. She had been so focused on her career, on healing and rebuilding herself, that she hadn't given much thought to the idea of children. But as Hui asked the question, she realized it wasn't something she feared anymore. It was something she could see, something that felt like a natural extension of the life they had created. "I do," Lynn said after a moment, her voice soft. "I never used to think I could have that. I was so focused on getting back to who I was, I didn't think about the possibility of becoming someone new. But now, with you, I think it's something I could want. Not right away, but someday." Hui's smile widened. His eyes filled with warmth. "I'd like that too, someday." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Lynn felt a deep sense of contentment, knowing that she and Hui were on the same page about their future. It was no longer something to be feared, but something to look forward to, a new chapter they could write together. The months that followed were filled with quiet joys and small adventures. Lynn's art continued to thrive, with galleries reaching out to her from across the country. But she was careful not to lose herself in the whirlwind of success. She kept her feet planted firmly in the life she and Hui had built, always coming back to the simplicity of their home by the sea. Hui's work also grew, his environmental projects gaining recognition for their impact on the local community. Together, they supported each other's dreams, while finding balance in their individual pursuits while staying connected to what mattered most, each other. One day, as they sat together in their cozy living room, Hui brought up something that had been on his mind for a while. I've been thinking, he said, glancing over at Lynn with a thoughtful expression. Maybe it's time we make some changes to the house. Expand a little. You know, just in case we decide to grow our family sooner rather than later. Lynn looked at him, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Are you saying you want to start now? Hai shrugged, but his grin gave him away. I'm saying we should be prepared. And if it happens, well, I wouldn't mind. Lynn laughed, feeling a lightness in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. The idea of starting a family no longer scared her. It felt right, like the next natural step in the life they were building together. Well, Lynn said playfully, if we're going to expand the house, I get to pick the design. Deal, Huai replied, leaning over to kiss her gently. I trust your vision. As the days turned into weeks, Lynn and Hui began making plans for the future. They talked about expanding their home, about what their life would look like if they had children, and about the kind of parents they wanted to be. It wasn't something they were rushing into, but it was a conversation that filled Lynn with a quiet joy. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, Lynn turned to Huai with a smile. I've been thinking a lot lately, she said softly. About what? Huai asked, his eyes curious. About everything. About how far we've come. About how I never thought I'd be here. This happy. This at peace. Huai reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. You've come a long way, Lynn. We both have. I couldn't have done it without you, Lynn said, her voice filled with emotion. You helped me find myself again. And now, I feel like anything is possible. Huai smiled, pulling her close. It is. We've got our whole lives ahead of us. They sat together, watching as the sky turned shades of pink and gold, their future stretching out before them like the endless horizon. Lynn knew there would be challenges ahead. Life wasn't perfect, and neither were they. But whatever came next, she and Hui would face it together. They had built something strong, something lasting, and for the first time in her life, Lynn felt truly at home. As the seasons changed and the years rolled by, Lynn and Hai's life unfolded in ways they hadn't fully anticipated, but always with the same sense of partnership and love. They expanded their home as planned and eventually welcomed a child into their lives, a new adventure that brought its own set of challenges and joys. Through it all, Lynn continued to paint, her work evolving as her life did. Her art became a reflection of the love, growth, and transformation she had experienced, and it resonated with people all over the world. But no matter how much success she achieved, her heart remained with the quiet life she and Hui had built. They spent their days by the sea, raising their child, creating a life filled with laughter, love, and meaning. And every evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Lynn knew that she had finally found the happiness she had been searching for. She had come full circle, from the broken girl who had once been betrayed and lost, to the strong, independent woman who had found love, success, and most importantly, herself. The end. Would you like to adjust any part of the story, or do you feel it's complete as it is?